Hey, it's great to be here, Jeremy. Thanks a lot. I mean, you really do have one of the best podcasts, and I mean, the courage to have Ilan Papa, Norman Finkelstein, to do a great job of dealing with the Zionist calamity, and Kevin McDonald is another great guest. You know, his cultural critique books, and I really enjoyed him as well. And then you have Michael Yeadon dealing with germ theory myths. So I really appreciate your and Mike and Germar Rudolph and David Cole, the courage to really deal with everything. So I'm really thrilled to be someone in their company. Thanks.
I just want to quickly go to your name. You were telling me now just before we started recording what it means. Kiss the girl, did you say?
So kiss means beso in Spanish. So besada means a woman that has been kissed in the past. So my name is Jorge, woman that has been kissed in the past. So, you know, if I get married someday, my wife is going to have a very good name, you know. And it never brought me any problems growing up, surprisingly. So, okay, so I was born in Cuba, and it's kind of unique, and I realized that later on growing up. I mean, I was born deep into like communist ideology. I was raised, you know, to be like the Soviet man. I mean, I was largely raised by my grandmother. She would pick me up from school, and she's someone who had like a PhD in biology. So she raised me like the whole Soviet thing. You're supposed to be good at chess and, you know, not really be religious. So I was born very, very deep into that. And, you know, in Cuba, like I remember having ice trucks. These are things that people in my generation don't have, but we used to, you know, a lot of times, you know, keep our food cold because a truck would deliver a big block of ice and then you would break it up and put it in your fridge. So that relates to like the communism and the poverty that we sort of had. But that did play a big factor on me. Like I left Cuba when I was 7. I came to Miami, which is like Cuba 2.0, when I was 11 years old. Then while going to school, getting a degree in computer science, I took some courses on anthropology, you know, just because I think it just pushed me from my grandmother, the secularism. And that's where I stumbled first upon Herbert Spencer, who's a great evolutionary thinker. And Herbert Spencer is the guy that coined the phrase survival of the fittest. A lot of people don't know that. And he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin referred to Herbert Spencer as 20 times my superior. And he also said that everyone with eyes to see and ears to hear ought to bow their knee to you, and I for one do. So Herbert Spencer really got me in an evolutionary like perspective. And then once I graduated from college, I met a friend. His name was Ted. You know, hi Ted. I have to, you know, say hello to him. And I got very lucky because a lot of us, you know, we grow up, a lot of times we're not interested in anything. I never had an interest in reading much. But Ted transformed my life. We had a conversation very early after we started working. And he said, hey, George, you really should read these 2 books. You should read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and a book by Stephen Levy called Artificial Life, Where Computers Meet Biology. So Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it. If you go to Amazon.com right now, it's always like 2 or 3 on many Amazon.com bestsellers. And it's a book that tries to show, in an evolutionary manner, looking at genetics and so on, why human beings can be so selfish, but at the same time be so altruistic, but looked at from a very evolutionary perspective. But then the second book, you know, is a book that shows how artificial life, you know, how in computers you can simulate evolution and you can end up creating, you know, self-replicating molecules, and you can eventually create kind of like living things. So my friend right there really pushed me in a much more evolutionary direction, where it got me thinking. It's like, wait a minute, evolution is something that creates not just the biological order, but also the entire social order and the entire economy and everything. And then just a few months later, same friend, he tells me, hey, George, you should read this book. It's called The Road to Serfdom by a very famous economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, and his name is Friedrich Hayek. So I read that book, and the first time I read any book, like in political economy or anything, I mean, I only understood like, you know, 10% of it. But it's not the book I would recommend people to get like into economics. But it did get me eventually down the path to meet this so-called Austrian school economist, you know, that are really, these men really are like the backbone of freedom. All the free market movements that we've seen, I'm assuming even in South Africa, you've heard of like Ron Paul. You're familiar with Ron Paul? And actually, I'll be at his 90th birthday, which is coming up tomorrow. And so when Ron Paul was a medical student at Duke University, he stumbled upon Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And that is what made him like a free marketeer. Margaret Thatcher as well. She was an 18-year-old student at Oxford when she read The Road to Serfdom. That got her into understanding freedom. Javier Milei, who is now a free market guy in Argentina, he too stumbled upon one of the works of the Austrians, and it's great because he admitted that he had already been an economist, but he said that for 25 years everything I've been teaching was wrong until I stumbled upon the Austrians. And the last person I'll mention, Ayn Rand. A lot of people are familiar with her work. She was a very pro-capitalism person. And she herself said that, quote, the greatest thing that ever happened to me regarding political economies was running into Ludwig von Mises. So that really is the foundation for a lot of her work. And so I eventually stumbled upon these people and their ethos, and really the ethos of what I try to do. Like Mises, he said, quote, all reasonable men are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is, in our age, the primary civic duty. And when you understand that it's economic ignorance that then leads to all the statism and all this coercion and this lack of prosperity, like Mises, I'm like, wait a minute, we have to educate people. And so that's really like how I got, to where I am. And one more thing I'll say about like the Austrians is that they were also something a lot of people don't realize. They were deep, like evolutionary minded thinkers. They look at the root causes of like how things sort of like evolved, how our identities, how our cultures like co-evolved with the entire economy. So
the whole evolutionary aspect goes beyond biology. I mean, you have the evolution of culture and the evolution of societies. I think I got into Mises maybe about 11 years ago. I've had a love-hate relationship since then with the sort of free market ideas, because I've often found that individuals who promote their work tend to focus only on economics and tend to forget about the importance of things that are downstream from culture. In other words, economics is downstream from culture.
I mean, it's very complex and they really feed off of each other. So sometimes you can get a bureaucrat or someone who comes up with good economic policy, and then that good economic policy can shape the culture. And, because, for example, economic competition also shapes our morals. It is hardworking, tolerant, courteous people who show up on time and treat everyone else with respect, who, thanks to economic competition, motivate everyone else to be likewise, right? So if you have the right economic policies, you inadvertently end up creating a culture of hard work, of tolerance, of treating everyone with respect, and so on. But, they really do grow from each other. And, so I'll tell you like one more quote that relates to this whole like evolutionary thing. So Friedrich Hayek, he mentioned the following. He said, we understand now that all enduring structures above the level of the simplest atoms, up to the brain and society, are the results of and can be explained only in terms of processes of selective evolution. So to the Austrians and Hayek, it's like an evolutionary process shapes not just the biological order, but also like the social order, culture, and this really relates to even how we look at the world, like Jew-Gentile conflicts. If we want to understand the chaos that's going on in Palestine, we can't just say that, okay, these are the good guys or the bad guys. In the animal kingdom, when I think sometimes like when a lion takes over a pride, and sometimes they'll kill the cubs so the females can mate again or something like that. Right? We don't say that the lion is evil. Right? We understand that there's an evolutionary reason why all these bad things happen. And to the Austrians, I think, since they looked at things in a very evolutionary way, they also were very detached. They said, look, a lot of things are just the result of the complex evolution of history and the mistakes that people made. And we really want to understand these mistakes in order to to make sense of things instead of just calling people like good and evil.
Modern society becomes so artificial that it moves so far away from natural order.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And this has a lot to do also with economics. So like Friedrich Hayek, he was well aware that human beings evolved in these little tribal cultures where there was no money, where we intuitively shared things, where there was a lot of violence, right? So we have carried those instincts are actually what motivate us in many ways to fall for central planning. Since we evolved in a world where there was no money, where there was no economic competition, where there was no interest rates, where there was no finance and banking, in today's modern world, all of those things are very foreign to our instincts. So the first thing that intuitively comes to us is if there's people who have more, then the solution is just to take from the wealthy and redistribute. So there's a great book by David Rubin. It's called Darwinian Politics, where he tries to look also at how we have evolved in these little tribes and how those instincts make us less adapted to living in a modern world where we really need to respect private property and the freedom of people so that we have a prosperous society. But it is also true how our instincts are not ideally suited to living in modernity, and we have to be aware of those things, how that makes us inadvertently far from communism, but to also know who we are, right? The kind of foods we ate. I know you had Nina Teals, I forgot her name, how in many ways, we evolved to eat like more meat and just like a natural diet. And now we're living in this world with all this processed food. It's just one of those many areas where modernity has inadvertently shaped our environment, where we are totally detached from the evolutionary order where we were ideally made to to thrive. And that's one of the things that we have to figure out. We have to be aware of those things and to see, well, how can we eat natural, and how has modernity taken us away from this, and how we can maybe, find that type of balance. So again, the Austrians are really people who help look at, how all this whole mess is kind of like evolved.
When you talk about Austrian economics, the layperson will assume you're talking about Austria.
Right. It's not quite that. So the Austrian economics really comes from the fact that the main founder, this man called Karl Menger, he was from that area. And Karl Menger, again, very important. He was a deep evolutionary thinker. And one of his main contributions was to say, okay, we're going to study the social, we're going to study society as an organism using the tools of biology. So instead of having this world of mathematics and all these formulas or believing you can predict all these things, he said, no. The way to understand society is to try to see how things sort of have evolved and treat it as a social organism. And one of his, what I like to call the flux capacitor discovery of the social sciences is how he showed how money is vital for everything in modern society. Money is really what enables the division of labor and information that creates the social order. So this is a very important, simple example. If you look at a tribal society, if you look at the content of people's minds, they all have the same information. Everybody knows how to just hunt some simple things, how to cook some simple meals. The information is repeated across every brain. But once you have trade, you have this, every brain, you have the division of information. Every brain can learn how to do just one thing. I can make coconut pastries. And then when I trade my coconut pastries for the guy who makes chairs, I don't have to know anything about the chairs. I can trade my coconut pastries for the guy who makes beaver pelts or makes boats, and I don't have to know anything about the boats. So trade creates a division of information that then allows you to have a society where you can have doctors, computer programmers, and all those things. So you can now have unlimited amounts of information. But in order for you to have trade, you need to overcome what's called double coincidence of wants problem. If I have my coconut pastries and I want to trade them for the guy who has the beaver pelts, what are the chances that he wants my coconut pastries? Very small chance. So once you have money, then anybody can trade, and then the benefits of the division of information can spread throughout the whole society, and then you can start just having progress and build living standards and so on. So without money, if we didn't have money tomorrow, in a matter of months, society would just collapse. There would be no coordination, no production, and we go back to living like primitive savages. So, but the key insight of Karl Menger, he showed that money, which is something that is vital for economic competition, profit and loss calculation, everything that creates the modern social order, was not the result of our reason. We never had some great genius say, oh, we're going to invent money so we can overcome the division of the double coincidence of wants problem, so we can have profit and loss calculation, economic competition. We never had that. It's just like the cells in your body over millions of years. They created the respiratory, the circulatory, the digestive systems that allow single cells to cooperate into multicellular systems. But obviously the cells did not design that, right? The exact same thing happened with the social order. Human beings, without realizing it, they invented money, and then they invented profit loss calculation and all the things that make the social organism work without realizing it. So that is a key insight that Karl Menger came up with that helped further members of the Austrian school really understand why we fall for all these errors. And that's what socialism was. In the late 1800s, society was getting so complex. Businessmen were creating so much wealth, and people thought to themselves, wait a minute, this is unfair. Why have 20 businessmen get rich? Why not just have a couple of experts tell everybody else what to do? We can share the wealth. And that is what it led to socialist mythology spread, and then, bring about, communism and so on. So anyway, I went on a big tangent there.
Do you think that hyper-individualism has also led to part of what we're seeing in the West now with the collapse, where people are no longer interested in their communities, families, because they're only interested in this in themselves with their cell phone and their AirPods?
don't think so. I mean, one of the things I don't like about like libertarians sometimes, and some of this hyper-individualism, sometimes you run into some libertarians, some hardcore free market people that they'll tell you, oh, I have a right to have a nuclear weapon in my house. You know, who are you to tell me that I can't do this? I have a right to do this and this. And it is true, some of these people are just like little automatons. You know, they're not thinking about society at large and how this affects the rest of society. So I agree with you in that sense that there are a lot of hyper-individualists that really just end up putting people off and so on. But I do think like the reason why we have a lot of these problems are people are so segregated as well. A lot of it just has to do with government intervention. You know, the governments, I mean, when in the United States, you're blowing $1.5 trillion every year to finance this massive military. I mean, that's as much wealth as the entire country of Spain produces. And you're printing up all this money, all this debt, you know, ultimately just to, you know, to sustain Zionism, actually, you know. And I do think that if we had a better economy, I do think people would not be as isolated, you know. But it is very hard to predict. We really can't predict what's going to happen once we get like sex robots and all of these things. So I do. That's the thing. Like no one can really predict where freedom and how civilization is going to evolve. I hope it evolves in a way where we get in touch with our human nature. We know we're slightly smarter apes. We need other human beings around us. We need touch. We need friendships and all these things. But again, it's actually hard to predict. But to wrap up, I mean, I think what's really causing all these problems is the economic ignorance that then leads to all the statism that makes it hard for people to, you know, to have kids. I mean, how many women these days can really afford, you know, to have children? How many families can do it? It's getting harder and harder and harder. And then that has all kinds of other like repercussions. So yeah, there's a lot of annoying pro-freedom people. But at the same time, I mean, I think the problem is more like the economic ignorance that then leads to all the statism.
It's also about trying to preserve a history and preserve a culture. Here in South Africa, you've got the Boers who became the Afrikaners. If they were all hyper-individuals, there would be no Afrikaner culture. Well,
you mentioned the Boers and you guys in South Africa. I mean, I wish you had finished off Churchill when you had the opportunity. Okay?
Yes, he escaped.
Right. And then he wrote all these things about how great he was. But yeah, I mean, you know, this really touches, you know, a lot of these conflicts. If everyone had a better understanding of freedom and free markets, and we just respected private property, and we have companies always competing against each other, innovating, you know, because that's what free market competition does. It turns the entire planet into a supercomputer where every private sector company is innovating and copying the innovations of others, constantly spreading the best ideas to society, bringing prosperity. Like I said earlier, it also civilizes us. And a lot of this chaos, we just have to find a way to educate people so that we no longer have this identity versus identity type of things, which obviously you have in South Africa. And I mean, and obviously the Israeli-Palestinian chaos just like, you know, grows from that. And I do very quickly, I wanted to throw another quote from Mises, because since this man had this very evolutionary way of looking at things, they were also very sympathetic towards trying to understand our problems. So Mises said, "Neither as judges allotting praise and blame, nor as avengers seeking out the guilty should we face the past. We seek truth, not guilt. We want to know how things came about to understand them, not to issue condemnations." And one more, history should teach us to recognize causes and to understand driving forces. And when we understand everything, we will forgive everything. So again, that's part of the ethos of these men. It's about understanding, because again, you know, it's all about blaming each other. You know, who were the good guys? Who were the bad guys? And that's just driving us, you know, to more conflicts. A lot of people fool themselves into thinking that just because modernity and modern capitalism arose from Europe, where we got the Industrial Revolution and so on, this leads to a lot of misguided, like racialist type of thinking. And you can't really blame white people for feeling like, oh, you know, modernity came up in Europe and then therefore it must be somehow tied to our genes. That's a very popular fallacy, and it's the root of a lot of this, you know, white ethno-nationalist, you know, kind of nonsense. But again, as Mises himself even mentioned, Mises said, like, if you look at modern civilization, it arose from other civilizations. I mean, where would we be if it wasn't, you know, for the Egyptians? I mean, the Arabic numerals, you know, where do those things come from? You know, so, right. And a lot of civilizations, they were in the Middle East and in other places where we didn't have, you know, the pasty white people. And we're seeing right now what you're hinting at. You know, the Chinese are the ones they're not getting stuck up with all these like weird things that we're doing. Sure, they had the communist experiment. They survived it. But now, I mean, I've been to China, and again, you just have people working, and it makes sense why they are, you know, overtaking us.
You mentioned Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. It was one of the first books that I read from that sort of category of ideas. But you've spoken a lot about Mises. I think the only book I've read of his is Human Action, but it is a great book.
Wow. I mean, yeah, that is a great book. And actually, in Human Action, there's so much wisdom in there. And one of the sections in Human Action, I wrote a little article about it at the Mises Institute. It's called The Fight Against Error. So there's a section in there where Mises talks about how we really need to fight errors. Mises says that we cannot get too deep into the moral sphere and make people who have different views from us into like evil. And Mises rightly noticed how you get a lot of that between like the religious Catholic people and the Marxists. They were attacking each other. I mean, obviously the Marxists saw religious people as irrational people that you needed to get rid of to have your socialist nirvana. And religious people made the mistake of referring to the communists as satanic, as evil. So when you have that attitude, as Mises said, no social cooperation, can be found there. And the same thing applies to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A lot of people want to say that the Israelis are just, a bunch of evil, conquerors, especially from the very left wing. The very left wing loves to equate Israel with racist capitalism, right? Without really looking at the complex history of anti-Semitism and so on. And then the Jews, the Israelis, unfortunately do the same thing. They just say, oh, these guys are a bunch of like extremists, terrorists and so on. But getting back to The Road to Serfdom, right? So that book is really one of two ways in which the Austrians saved like civilization. A little earlier, before The Road to Serfdom, so Ludwig von Mises, when the Bolsheviks took over, Ludwig von Mises by himself, and I really want to read this little quote here from Mises, by himself, he managed to talk to the Austrian politicians and he persuaded them, just one man, against joining the Bolsheviks and becoming like a part of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's incredible. So I got a little quote from Mises. This is what he said about his life in 1919. He said, "There were few who recognized the state of affairs clearly. People were so convinced of the inevitability of Bolshevism that their main concern was securing a favorable place for themselves in the new order. The Catholic Church and its followers, the Christian Social Party, were prepared to befriend the Bolsheviks with the same eagerness with which the bishops and archbishops would embrace National Socialism 20 years later." And Mises said, "The most important task I undertook was the forestalling of a Bolshevist takeover. The fact that events did not lead to such a regime change in Vienna was my success and mine alone. Few supported me in my efforts. I alone convinced Bauer, the leading politicians, to abandon the idea of seeking union with Moscow." So Mises, again, incredible that one man was able to do that. And then this ties into Hayek, because Mises, for a while, he kind of hired Hayek, to be a part of like a think tank in Austria. And then just a few years later, Mises would write, in 1922, he would write a book, Socialism, which was just like, incredible. And then Hayek read that book, and that really transformed him. It helped him. And then Hayek got a job at the London School of Economics, where quickly Hayek became like one of the most respected people there. And then during the end of the Second World War, that's when Hayek realized that the British, they think that because they have a democracy, that they're going to be shielded from the hardcore tyranny that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union got. But Hayek got the idea to write The Road to Serfdom to warn them that if they kept asking for all this government stuff, more power to a central competition immune coercive bureaucracy, that they were on the way, to the road to serfdom. And that's when he wrote that book. And another nice little tidbit in there, when Hayek wrote that book, he was expected to come to the United States and just go on a little speaking tour to some small campuses, or whatever. But thanks to Henry Hazlitt, who is Henry Hazlitt wrote Economics in One Lesson, which is the most widely read economics book. So Henry Hazlitt was working at the New York Times at the time, and he read Hayek's book and he loved it. And he managed to put a great review of the book on the front page of the readers section of the New York Times. So that created a sensation of like interest in the book. So when Hayek came to the United States, his first talk was given in like a basketball stadium to like 3,000 people. And then later on, I just want to throw in another great like champion of like freedom. There was a gentleman, his name is Max Eastman, and he was one of the most famous socialists in the United States. This is a man that had gone to Moscow in the 1920s. He was a good friend of Trotsky. He translated Trotsky's works into English. But Max Eastman stumbled upon Mises and Hayek, and he made a 180, and he became a free marketeer. So he took Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, and he created a condensed version, which is only 40 pages. And that managed to be sold to over 1 million homes in the United States. And that ended up educating so many people like, Ron Paul, I think I might have mentioned earlier, he was a medical student at Duke University when he stumbled upon, and also Margaret Thatcher,
And
Javier
Milton
Milei.
Friedman.
Oh, Milton Friedman, he was a big fan of Hayek, and he even mentioned that Hayek's
Yeah.
played a big role. I don't know how much Milton Friedman's education came from Mises. I think since they were around the same time, I think his major ideologues were other people. He was another person who was greatly influenced by the Austrians. So again, between Mises and Hayek, between Mises saving us from joining the Bolsheviks and Hayek with his road to serve them, they really did like save civilization almost twice.
Have you noticed how many people are suddenly pulled back into the system because of somebody like Donald Trump? Because now suddenly the state is the good guy again. But it's the same state that was oppressing people.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something a lot of us, have noticed. I mean, in many ways, it has helped a little bit, right? Because the COVID mania tyranny, I mean, it got so many of us to wake up and say, okay, something needs to happen. I mean, this is very personal because I was working, I had a comfortable job at Microsoft, when the COVID mania tyranny came. And by the time COVID mania tyranny came, I've already been in the world of freedom. I understand the Bolshevik Revolution, how the masses, through economic ignorance, can just self-mutilate. And that really motivated me to get off my butt and get more involved. Maybe the reason why you stumble upon me now, because there's thousands of libertarians and people like myself. Well, we read books, we're writing a little book or something. But it took the COVID mania to say, okay, wait a minute, I got to get out there. I got to meet other people. I got to get involved and do something. And this also helped fuel like the Javier Milei revolution as well. It was the COVID tyranny. When you look at Milei's, what he did in Argentina, the COVID mania tyranny and the lockdowns, it really motivated him and many like-minded people to try to do something. And I like to call it the communism, So that's why, just like you said, we're noticing that we need to understand, the history of the 20th century. And it's really, the good thing is that thanks to these men, to these Austrians that explain all of these things, and the Milton Friedman and all of these people, that now our generation has to really like nip it in the bud. I mean, we really have to like finish this.
If freedom is something that matters to you, then relying less on the government should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, but it's very important to realize that. For example, you already read Human Action. I mean, you're someone who is deep in the freedom world. But we have to realize that the masses are clueless, right? The people are clueless. If there is no people out there, there's another quote, I don't remember it, but Mises said that liberalism is rationalistic. It believes that with reason we can educate the immense masses. I mean, I'm butchering the quote, And Mises also says that it could be that liberals are wrong, that maybe we can't convince the masses. But if we do not even try, if we don't have belief, if we don't have the attitude where we think that we can educate the masses, then there's no hope left for mankind. If those of us who know better don't educate people, then we're obviously going to have more socialism, more statism, and we see it all around us. So, I mean, that too is part of the Misesian ethos. So we have to realize that those of us who are for individual rights, for self-reliance, and a lot of this stuff, a lot of times we don't realize that we got lucky and we stumble upon the right ideas. And we have to go out there and educate these people, even though I understand 90% of the time they're calling you names, they're calling you a right-wing extremist and that kind of stuff. And but again, we have to spread the iconogospel. That's what I like to call it.
You are aware, though, that a number of my listeners are going to dismiss a lot of what you're saying because you mentioned Milei, for example, and he's a Zionist.
That's a great point. And but that just goes to show how very bright people can still make monumental errors, right? And again, I have to throw a great Hayek quote, which really applies not only because I like to see Zionism as a massive intellectual error that fooled a lot of bright people, just like communism, right? I can't say my grandmother was a hardcore communist, was either stupid or evil. And to me, we have to look at the Zionists the same way. People who understandably fool themselves into a monumental calamity. So this is what Hayek said. Hayek said, most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini, Lenin or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appeal to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. Boom. And the Zionists are out there thinking that they have the moral high ground, that no matter what happens, if they have to expel the Palestinians, this is all, we're doing the moral thing. They're the irrational terrorists. So it's a great quote showing how, we can fool ourselves into these things. And
one of the problems with individualism is that it opens more people up to the idea of globalism and therefore infiltration of the mind by sort of these big agendas that are going on around us. And therefore it's important to have a collective group of people who can buffer against or who can resist, in other words, a sovereign state.
I'm very sympathetic to that sort of thinking, in a way, because I think the push for globalism, globalism is also just global free trade. It's also the respect of individual rights, for people all over the world. So we don't, there are two forces kind of like pushing. You have people who feel like, wait a minute, I should be free to maybe travel to South Africa or live there or marry someone from there. So on the one hand, the globalism, the good globalism, is just more integration, more freedom for people to respect individual rights and so on. But at the same time, again, the world is very complex. We're also realizing that if you just have something like, like open borders, right? Then suddenly an entire culture or language that took thousands of years to develop can suddenly be wiped out by an invading.
We're seeing that happening across Europe.
Of course, that is happening in Europe and so on. So I am very sympathetic towards the people who feel like, wait a minute, just because I want to have some kind of like borders and I want to be able to prevent our language and our culture, or even if it's our DNA, I don't think those people should be vilified, as being like, the precursors to like the Nazis and so on. As long as we understand, some basic things. But I can see how that then relates, because then we get some real hardcore Nazis. Some people say, oh, I don't want any immigrants, or this kind of stuff. So, yeah, so it's very tricky. I think we should just do our best to understand all of these complexities and then have some like reasonable policy that is not based on just pure racism, or coercing people to have their culture destroyed, because so yeah, it's very complex. So the best we can do is just understand and.
Or for example, if a group of individuals want to create their own town, then they should be free to do so.
Yeah, of course, right. And that gets to anarcho-capitalism, and Murray Rothbard. Because if competition is how we discover the best way to build products, why not have competition in legal systems? Right? So yeah, of course, people should have the freedom to do all those things. I'm totally fine with some hyper-racists say, well, only white people are going to be allowed in here. I don't think it's ever going to happen because people naturally, based on the connections that they make at work, and so on. So a lot of people fear this hyper, racism, but it's not really going to happen. If you just have freedom, human beings will discover that we're all just Homo sapiens and it'll evolve a culture, of that. So yeah, I'm totally fine. Yeah. And who knows what's going to happen too. We are getting all of these changes, whether it's sex robots, all kinds of, I'm against, a lot of these things. I understand how, it took 4 billion years to create something as well made as a human being. And a lot of these experts think that with the little pills, right? You and I know that all these pills just destroy the biochemical order, that took 4 billion years to create. So just like in the social order, this stupid central planners think that they can better coordinate society and they actually destroy something that evolved, through freedom and exchange. They're doing the same thing with medicine, they're destroying the biochemical order. Anyway, I got in a weird tangent there, but.
It's a book by Herman Hoppe called Democracy, the God That Failed. And I keep going back to that because he speaks about monarchy being preferable to democracy. And one of his arguments is that a monarch owns his land, so therefore it's private property.
Sure. it's a great book, right? Democracy, the God That Failed. I read it as well. And I remember being shocked, by that thing where like a monarch really has to control his country, his private property, and treat it well instead of the democratic politicians that just plunder the whole thing. And I can totally see how if we have more freedom, I can see Elon Musk buying his own city and then he can become his own little monarch there. And but those are things that you and I tolerate because we understand, how freedom works. So I can totally see that happening. And, I look forward to that. I look forward to a Motown themed city, where it's about, the great singers in Motown, or having a city where the people dress it up in their medieval ways. And because the truth is that as long as the masses remain ignorant, what good does it do us to have our own little island where maybe we have a little bit of freedom, but the masses destroy the worldwide division of labor in a nuclear war? Or the Zionist calamity sparks another world war. So economic education is really...
What do you think is our natural way of doing things? Let's just say that you and I are dumped onto an island in the middle of nowhere.
If you and I end up in an island, you and I understand like freedom. We have already inherited a culture that respects other people. So there's all this software that took thousands of years to get into our minds. So I'm sure we would do, great, right? But the truth is, like, instinctively, we're dangerous animals, I mean, human beings, we can use our wisdom to make like our nukes. I mean, assuming the nukes exist, and, the Spanish inquisitors had a lot of wisdom, but they used that wisdom to create torture devices, to do all kinds of things. So, intuitively, we have to realize that modernity just arose in the last 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, we were out there having sex with animals. There's a reason why the Bible tells women, do not lay with a beast. Because 10,000 years ago, before we civilized ourselves to respect private property, we were wild and animalistic people. So that's very important. We have to realize that we are these dangerous, tribal animals. So I think you and I would be great as long as we educate people and so on, and we keep the culture going. But we could descend into like tribal, chaos.
You've read Lord of the Flies.
I was thinking I have not read that, but I remember in high school they were giving that to everyone, and it's about some young kids that end up doing that kind of stuff. I was about to bring it up, but I haven't read it.
Basically, what you're arguing, Jorge, is everybody must be left alone and the government should butt out of everybody's lives.
What I'm arguing is what Mises is arguing is for people to understand freedom. Because if everybody right now understood free market economics and then the government just cuts down in size, then we will have our private cities, instead of having your court building be this massive structure with this godlike priest with a robe, we would have efficient legal systems. So we would just have skyrocketing, prosperity. So, I mean, that's, again, and if I say anything that makes sense, remember, it's because I got lucky and I stumbled upon the Austrians, So I think we would just have like, skyrocketing prosperity.
I think it was Milton Friedman who said that if the government took control of the Sahara Desert, there'll be a shortage of sand in the next 5 years.
Yeah. Great quote. You see, in the private sector, every living thing, every orderly thing is in a never-ending cycle of production and consumption. An animal in the wild, like a lion, right? He has to produce, he has to hunt a zebra. So he produces something, then he consumes it, right? And he has a profit, something that he can then consume while he keeps like living. Every order in the private sector is always doing profit and loss calculation. Every business has sales revenue that is a sign of how much you have produced. Then you have costs, which is a sign of how much you have consumed. And then you have profit, which is really a sign of by how much more you have grown the economic pie, right? But the government is a massive social structure that doesn't do profit and loss calculation. It just taxes. And the bureaucracy also doesn't have to compete. I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier. I mean, competition is what turns the entire social order into a supercomputer, where every private sector business is motivated to innovate, but competition forces it to copy the innovations of competitors. So I don't know who came up with power door locks and power windows. He might have been a Honda engineer in Tokyo. But then competition motivated BMW in Germany, Chevy, Ford in the US to copy the power door locks idea. So again, that's only in the private sector. That is why as freedom increased in Europe, thanks to our evolving morals, we got, capitalism, and the government is just a coercive competition immune monopoly that doesn't have that. It destroys civilization. But this is, the insight of the Austrians, since this prosperity arose without people planning it. We're fooled. We're like cells in a body that suddenly said, instead of doing what we've been doing for 4 billion years, let's use our reason and start trying to tinkle with everything. And we just destroy the social order.
Criticisms you might get is, well, look at an organization like Microsoft or Google or Facebook. These are supposedly private companies, but they are so powerful, more powerful than many governments, that they can actually control the outcomes of social order.
I mean, that's a great point. But again, like, these things would not be happening. Like if more people thought like you and we understood how the big corporations can start influence the government, to do all kinds of nefarious things, and if the government right now controls everything, about 40% of our wealth is sent to this massive bureaucracy. If we had more people who understood these things, then we wouldn't have these problems. So, I understand, especially now, look at someone like Alex Karp and Palantir, right? We're getting the evolution of, the NKVD, but pro-Zionism. We will soon, just like in the COVID mania, we had the perverse incentives that led Pfizer stock to get really high, and the CEO of Pfizer telling us that if you're not getting a vaccine, you're like a criminal. We're really seeing the same thing, but with the ruling mythology of our day, with the Zionism. There's a lot of money to be made now in branding people anti-Semites, controlling the anti-Semites, and Microsoft. Actually, while I was working at Microsoft, I already saw the marriage between Microsoft is getting all these big government contracts, right? They're getting all these big government contracts. So now more and more of their revenue comes from a juicy government contract instead of competing out there, so they can start going along with all the silly regulations and start perversing their own incentives. So, but the key is for us to understand all these things and to, it's not like I'm for it. I am totally for some regulations, but we just have to have a well-educated public.
Ultimately, what you're seeing is not really true competition.
Exactly.
You mentioned Palantir, Google, Facebook. They are all in bed with various governments. That's how they got up there.
Yeah, exactly. Especially Palantir. And we know Big Pharma. Big Pharma, where would Moderna be if it wasn't for all the money they got for the COVID mania? And in the US, these big pharmaceutical companies, they all exist because of all the freebies that Medicare, since the elderly get free health care, and all the freebies just go to the corporations that are pushing all of the myths. That's why we need for the masses to understand real competition that leads to the real better ideas, instead of having, the government create all these myths,
I think that's the lesson that's coming through here, is the importance of competition.
But it's also important to remind people that, again, the competition in the economy is not a competition of like, I'm going to get killed, or something like that. All it is just a mechanism for creating and spreading the best ideas through society. That's all it does. It just, again, one entrepreneur comes up with something, the competitors have to copy it. That leads to society producing wealth at a faster rate. So you have more wealth. And then competition between laborers forces them to pay us more for our wages. So again, competition, people just really need to make the connection. And Friedrich Hayek, he wrote 2 classic papers. One is called The Use of Knowledge in Society, in which I highly recommend. And he wrote another one, for example, called Competition as a Discovery Procedure. It's telling you everything right there. That competition is just the mechanism that spreads knowledge and technology and prosperity to society, and how government, being a competition immune, coercive bureaucracy that doesn't have to learn, it just destroys things. So if we can get more people to that's one of the things what I really like about Hayek. He had this focus on information, which I think makes it easy to understand, how knowledge moves through society.
Do you think, therefore, that a government should not have a monopoly of violence?
Now we're getting into like this whole anarcho-capitalist stuff. And I think we should. If the government doesn't have a monopoly on violence, that means that somebody else will, a little private city or something like that, and now we will have competition in legal systems. So private cities, again, those are anarcho-capitalism. So I just want to throw Murray Rothbard's name in there, who was one of the great Austrians who wrote a lot about that. And David Friedman, too, the son of Milton Friedman, he wrote a classic book called The Machinery of Freedom that I highly recommend, that also looks at anarcho-capitalism. But many people have different ways of coming to anarcho-capitalism, or even the economy in general. There's the moral path that says that people have a God-given right to private property. And that's one way to treat the legal system. And then there's the utilitarian path that says, well, maybe I don't take my morality from some God, but I just think that this works better, right? So David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom is a utilitarian look at anarcho-capitalism, while Murray Rothbard is more like a moral thing, like we have a right, to be able to create like our own state or something like that.
Let me give you an example. Here in South Africa, our private security force outnumbers our police force by 4-1, which means that people believe or trust in private police way more than they trust in the state police.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think in the US is similar. I'm sure there's a lot more private police. And I'm also reminded in places like Disney World in Florida, they have their own private police there. And Disney World is like, it's like a mini city, right? So those are great examples to tell people. I mean, look at a small country like Grenada, right? If a small country like Grenada, which has like a population of 140,000 people or whatever, if we allowed Microsoft or Elon Musk, to buy a similar sized chunk of land, couldn't Elon, with all his geniuses and all his great computer programmer buddies, couldn't they manage a better way to like run security? Of course. I mean, we just got to let people try it. So yeah, those are great examples to get people to open up their minds.
You are aware, though, that many in my audience hate Elon Musk because he's a technocrat.
Yeah. But the truth is, like, it's very hard for us to know behind the scenes what exactly is in Elon's mind. Elon must know way more than he lets, look. And I am reminded when Javier Milei was deep into his election and he was about to win, Elon Musk has a huge bromance with Javier Milei. Regarding economics, he brought him over, he took him to the Tesla factory, and so on. And while the whole election with Milei was going on, Elon Musk shared two memes. He shared a meme with a picture of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And he said that Hayek was his favorite economist. And then he shared another meme. Because, Hayek has the same name as Selma Hayek, the hot actress. So he shared a meme with Selma Hayek with a wonderful Hayek quote. And the quote said that the most important thing we could do to ensure prosperity is to educate people about economics, which is, again, is everything I'm about, what the Austrians were about. So the fact that Elon Musk, the world's most wealthy man, finds Hayek to be a favorite economist, he's good friends with Milei. And that's where he got the whole idea to do the Doge thing, to go in there and try to cut spending. But there is a big difference between Elon Musk and Doge. Elon Musk, by Doge, he tried to cut the head of the snake. He tried to cut the spending and all the bureaucracy, but that head grows out of the economic ignorance of the masses and the clueless politicians. But Milei, with way less of a budget, way less of a name recognition, he's launching a real intellectual revolution in Argentina because Milei is out there striking the economic ignorance of the masses. Milei's educating the youth. He had a wonderful interview with, obviously he's awful, Ben Shapiro, where Milei was saying how he won the election in Argentina. And Milei laid it out. He said, we used to have like rock concerts, but we used to give out economics books. So Milei is doing what Mises told us to do, to go out there and educate people. So those are important differences to realize. You can't create an intellectual wave that can hopefully, turn things around.
I know that many in my audience despise a number of the individuals that you've spoken about. I don't hold the same views because I think that each of them has something of value to offer, and each of them also has something to discard. And I think we can learn from all of these and create our own perspective, our own worldview.
Yeah, again, to me, everything tied. I've read so much of these Austrians, I can find some quote or something, but we have to be sympathetic towards people who make mistakes. And I actually think that Milei's Zionism, it actually works to our advantage. I see Zionism as a massive intellectual error, right? But the fact that Milei is already a very hardcore pro-freedom person that is willing, to tolerate, we definitely need Milei to tolerate freedom of speech, especially when it comes to like Zionism and related stuff. And also the fact that Milei is loved by the Israeli politicians. I don't know if you noticed, but last month, and it was or a little over a month ago, it was actually during the same weekend that the Israelis attacked Iran. Milei was in Israel, and he gave a speech in the Knesset. And that speech, Benjamin Netanyahu spent 20 minutes talking about how great Milei was. Another famous Israeli politician also spoke for like 10 minutes talking about how great Milei was. So in many ways, you have all of these Israeli politicians treating Milei like he's the new Moses, right? Now, I understand a lot of that comes because Milei is just way over the head over Zionism. He thinks that the Zionists, are the beacon of Western civilization. But a lot of these Israeli politicians, they're very pro-free market. As a matter of fact, in Israel, they have like a libertarian party within the Likud, and they're hardcore pro-freedom people. So again, I just see Zionism as a mistake, and the fact that Milei is a Zionist, it just means that he's wrong. but maybe he can become a Zionist Gorbachev, right? We have to realize that the Soviet Union, a lot of people say, oh, the Soviet Union was just a bunch of evil bad guys. But if they were just a bunch of evil bad guys, assuming that the Zionists are a bunch of evil bad guys, we would have never had a Gorbachev or a Yeltsin. And I have to have faith that if we try, and the chaos continuously shows it, we will get a Zionist Gorbachev. So again, we have to be sympathetic. Just because people make me say, I was once a commie, right? Ludwig von Mises himself was once a socialist. So was Friedrich Hayek. So just because these people make mistakes, we can't really like hate them. We have to go out there and understand how they have fooled themselves into making these errors, which is, again, it's a very Misesian type of thing. So
to add to what you're saying, the reason why China is about to become the world's most powerful economy is because it has opened up its trading. It's way more free than what it was 50 years ago. The same as Qatar and the UAE. I mean, these are highly capitalist societies.
Yeah, they learned. And really, the only thing that's really holding us back, it's such a shame, right, that the United States, we're the home of Murray Rothbard, the adopted home of Mises. We're the guys that really had the capitalism. And it is sad that now the Chinese are in many ways, maybe they have already reached a point where they're even more capitalist than we are. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we really have to somehow overcome Zionism. I mean, it's another big kind of worms, but it really is we can't have prosperity if we're blowing $1.5 trillion every year on military spending. It's crushing us.
Just as we come in for the final lap, if somebody goes to your Substack, I think one of the first articles they'll see is why we should all be Holocaust deniers. Quickly explain that to me.
Whoa, okay, I'm going to get killed now. I mean, number one, let me say something about the freedom of speech, right? I mean, for me to realize that there are human beings that are put in prison for the content of their minds, for example, regarding the Holocaust, okay, a lot of people are not aware. Right now, we have the 40 beheaded babies myth with Hamas, right? That was a total myth, right? There was some of the guys who were tasked with getting the bodies, some guy exaggerated, and they have their little charities where, they need to make money by showing how all these things are happening. So that ended up being a massive myth. And soon afterwards, the Israeli Knesset, they were already talking about passing a law to ban what they called October 7th denial, right? So right now, we just saw in real time how out of the complexities of history, a war, war myths and propaganda are things that happen all the time. During the First World War, we had the Germans chopping off the hands of Belgian babies, crucifying Canadian soldiers. Those are all myths that arise, during wars. So during the Second World War, I mean, a lot of people don't know, for example, during the Nuremberg trials, right? The Nuremberg trials, the Soviet delegation in the Nuremberg trials, okay, was led by Andrei Vyshinsky. He was Stalin's judge who implemented the Shoal trials. So the same judge that implemented the Shoal trials in Stalin's Russia from 1936 to 1938, where they signed the orders that killed 700,000 people, executed all of Lenin's friends, the same guy was the top judge of the Soviet delegation during the Nuremberg trials. Anybody in the Nuremberg trials, they blamed the Germans for the Katyn Forest massacre, where they killed like 20,000 Poles. That was done by the Russians, right? And the Russians put evidence saying that it was the Germans, right? And Churchill knew at the time, in the Nuremberg trials, in the official documents, you can find fabricated things where they killed, they killed people by electrocution chamber, brain bashing pedal driven machine, having people climb trees and then cutting the tree, all kinds of absurdities that today we know they were fabricated, right? So knowing all things, how can we put in jail someone that looks at all that stuff and then doubts the official narrative? Okay, never mind whether the official narrative happened exactly as they say they did or not. How can we be putting people in jail, for questioning something, for engaging in the competition of ideas, right? Something else that's very related to this. For example, look at the numbers. Prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? The official estimate of the people that got killed in Auschwitz was 4 million. And, a lot of people have seen the picture of the plaque that shows the 4 million people dying. So anyone doing their moral duty, because we all should have a moral duty to understand and speak the truth as we really see it and engage in the competition of ideas, especially for me. I've been in the free market world for 20 years. So we have a moral duty to speak the truth. So someone in 1985 saying that there's no way the Soviets could have killed 4 million people in Auschwitz. It had to be a way smaller number. That person would have been deemed a criminal and killed, right? And they would have been right after the collapse of the Soviet Union when the official authorities revised the number to like 1 million. So that is just, again, it's wrong. And also when you look at like the world of revisionism and the people who feel like, for example, Germar Rudolph, who you just had, on your show, in one of his books that I highly recommend, he wrote a book called Nazi Gas Chambers, The Roots of the Story, where Germar explains how the mainstream Holocaust narrative, which he considers to be a complex myth or an exaggeration, how it evolved. You had people spreading rumors, you had the little gas chambers that were made to disinfect clothing. So you had all the ingredients to create what eventually became a myth. He talks about the Nuremberg trials and all those things. But one of the very important things that Germar does, he specifically goes out of his way to let people know that the mainstream narrative was not some grand deliberate lie created by Jews, right? Just because Jews then understandably picked up on the story and they made it like part of their religion, it doesn't mean that the whole Holocaust narrative was plotted, by the Jews. So the point I want to make is that so again, anybody doubting, like I read a lot of Germar's books, and I've read, the great Dave Cole that you also had, his great documentary in Auschwitz, and I've looked into all of these things. Now, let us assume that Germar made mistakes, or that David Cole made mistakes, because of the complexity of history and everything that happened there. If they made mistakes, and now I read their works, and I am persuaded by them, why should I too be a criminal, right? And what if let's take it a step further. What if the people who question the mainstream Holocaust narrative are actually a bunch of Jew haters and they want to make some money by selling books, okay? Which is an understandable fear, because the truth is that there are some Jew haters out there, right? So, but even if we assume that they're just lying, so they can sell some books, and then I read their books and I am once again persuaded, should I be made a criminal? Or what if they read something by somebody who made mistakes or fabricated stuff, and then they are fooled into getting a different opinion that they can put you in jail? It's absurd. It's absurd to someone like myself who has such an understanding of freedom and so on. So the way I see it, not only do I believe that the mainstream Holocaust narrative is an exaggeration that grew out of Stalinist. I mean, Stalin had a reason to punish the Germans, to go along with the rumors, right? You can't blame them. Poland, the Polish communists, they got invaded by the Nazis. So it makes perfect sense that they might exaggerate the story. But to me, so I definitely believe Germar's side of things, that the Holocaust was not some grand invented thing, by the Jews, which a lot of Holocaust deniers think. And I also don't think it was the result of some malice, Germans, So I do believe what Germar is saying. But even if I didn't, let's just deny the thing anyway. Until we have freedom and real competition, how could we possibly know what happened?
Yeah. So in other words, even if you don't believe the entire story, so what?
Exactly. Deny it anyway. Deny it anyway until we do not have freedom and real competition of ideas. Then just deny it anyway. Because if 10,000 of us show up at the Bundestag, and that reminds me, I recently had a talk with Germar. There's a gentleman, his name is Friedrich Tobin. And he's one of these people who spent like 10 months in jail. And this man is a real hero that hardly anyone knows about. Friedrich Tobin went to Germany and he denied it on purpose so he could go to jail and make himself a martyr and make a point that this is just bullshit. Okay? So it's incredible when one looks at the history of Holocaust revisionism. Those are the real heroes.
Not just that, but similarly, if you wanted to say, well, the Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen. Okay, cool. So what?
Exactly. And there's a lot of hardcore communists who have a different take on the Bolshevik Revolution. They say, no, what Lenin wanted to do was great. It was the saboteurs and the evil, greedy capitalists that are distorting our view of history. I don't want to put those people in jail, right? So that is really the theme of my thing. It's like, no, but it's important. I question the Holocaust for real, but even if I didn't, we should have enough people that say, wait a minute, this is wrong. Let's go out there and deny it anyway, right? Because what really matters is not the truth itself. It's the fact that you have the freedom and the emerging competition of ideas that will then get you closer to the truth. I don't care exactly whether germ theory happens the way it is or whether the virus or whatever, but I have a good enough understanding of economics to really fight for what matters, is the freedom and the emerging competition of ideas. So all of these this so-called scholars at Jerm, those guys are as much scholars as were the economists in the Soviet Union, right? Of course, the Soviet Union had its think tanks of economists and all that, but their entire ideological structure evolved thanks to coercion and a mistake. So again, any Holocaust scholar, anybody wanting to make the case for the mainstream narrative or wanting to badmouth the revisionists, first let's have real freedom of speech, and then who knows, maybe it really happened exactly as they say, right? But fine, then I will read something better and I will take it more seriously and maybe I'll change my mind. But until then, I deny the Holocaust.
This entire conversation, Jorge, is reject the Frankfurt School of Economics.
And the Frankfurt and the Marxists, anyone who's not an Austrian, anybody who, to me,
and the Chicago school. I think Milton Friedman was part of the Chicago school.
That's a big subject, Unfortunately, human beings are human beings. And there's always a little bit of competition and negligence, of other intellectuals. The world of economics has that as well. Like Friedrich Hayek also taught at the Chicago school, at the same university, but they didn't give him a job inside the economics department. They gave him a job in like the School of Philosophy or something. And a lot of people feel like maybe that's because there was just a little bit of like the egos, or whatever. And there are major differences between the Chicago school and Milton Friedman and the Austrians. And as a matter of fact, Ludwig von Mises, who never took shit from anyone, Ludwig von Mises said that Milton Friedman is just a statistician, because the Austrians look at mathematics as just like all these mathematical models. It's like a biologist. A biologist doesn't look at a human body with mathematical formulas. You look at it in an evolved way. You want to see the evolution of things. So the Austrians look at the social order as an evolved thing. So we hardly pay any attention to math. But the Chicago guys and the Keynesians, they're more into the mathematical. So anyway, it's a massive subject. I don't want to get in trouble. I'm already in trouble as it is. But Milton Friedman, I love Milton Friedman. Wonderful guy, great educator. He has such a soft-spoken demeanor. He did so much to educate so many. But
Friedman was he was my gateway to Hayek and Mises actually.
Yeah, to me, early on, I read Capitalism and Freedom or something like that. From him. He, too, was one of my great early influences. And look, he did a great job with his son, too. So,
okay, Jorge, how can I follow you?
Yeah, so I have a website, besada.com, where one can download for free or even listen to some of the books I've written in the past. Also, please follow me on Twitter. My handle is Hayekian. Very easy to remember. And if you just also at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, I've published about 12 articles that, I highly recommend. Some of the articles get republished at lewrockwell.com. I've had a few things published at uns.com. And besada.com, and please follow me at Hayekian.
Jorge Besada, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Yeah, thank you.